Well, welcome everyone, virtually and here in person. My name is Rosarie Tucci. I'm the Acting Deputy Assistant Administrator at U.S. Agency for International Development, and really excited to be here today to talk about the safety and security of investigative journalists. It's always a little odd, to say, like, why are we here? And, because we know that we're here either despite or because of the effectiveness and the role that investigative journalists play in corruption, in combating corruption and supporting democracy. So a difficult story to tell, but it is one of, hope because of the effectiveness of the work that our colleagues do. And so what we're going to do today is really dive into the daunting set of challenges that investigative journalists are presented with, whether it's physical, digital, legal, psychosocial, political, and I think what we're seeing more and more today, some of the financial challenges. If we have time, we'll dive into that. Just to give a little bit of context, although I'm always conscientious of providing stats to groups that know these off the top of their head, but just to give a little flavor of what we'll dive into today. I think some of the most difficult stats are related to the physical threats that investigative journalists have every day. Every 5 days a journalist is killed, bringing information to the public. I think according to CPJ, that was some of the highest numbers killed in 2021. So really kind of hitting a peak at this point in time. I thought it was particularly interesting that these are not necessarily in conflict affected situations, with attacks really being perpetrated by organized crime, militia, local police, and so really pervasive challenge. We'll also dive into digital security, which has been a topic for the last decade or so. But I think with the surveillance software that's really designed for terrorists and criminals is now being used to target journalists. And so we'll dive into that and how it's being monitored on our phones and various pieces of technology. We're also seeing the challenge of online harassment, particularly against women. I know the U.S. government is tackling this issue in a global partnership of online gender-based harassment and abuse. I have to admit the acronym TFGBV, Technology Facilitated GBV, is gaining traction and really thinking about ways that we could tackle this challenge more deeply. We'll also talk about legal safety and actions such as strategic litigation against public participation. We'll talk more about that and how it has some of the greatest negative impacts on investigative journalists continuing their work. And then, of course, we'll dive into the psychological and physical health and well-being, the impact of trauma on these journalists. Some really staggering stats there as well. So let me just introduce our panel. It really does feel like a rock star group up here. First, we've got Pavla Helchova, who's based in Prague and is the regional editor for Central Europe for the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. You've worked on some of major cross-border projects such as the Panama Papers and the Russian and Azerbaijani laundromats. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us. Our second panelist, Carlos Eduardo Huertas, the director of Connect Us, a journalist platform whose mission is to promote the exchange of information on key issues in the Americas. And you lead the initiative for investigative journalism in the Americas. So thank you so much for being here. Our third panelist is Brittany B. Thank you for being here with us. You're the Chief of Party for USAID's Greater Internet Freedom Activity. We work very closely together and really appreciate your strategic guidance and leadership of GIF over the years. So thank you for being here. Our fourth panelist, Alexander Papachristou. Hopefully I'm saying all these names correctly, your last names. The Executive Director of the Vance Center. I'm historically bad with last names, so everybody knows. I really appreciate your leadership, leading the Vance Center and serving on the European Commission's anti-SLAPP working group, which we'll talk more about today. And then, of course, Jody Ginsburg, our final panelist, the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Okay, so if we could just dive right in, we'll start with looking at some of the challenges that you all are experiencing in your work. We'll dive deeper into this and really get a sense of how has it changed over the years and why do you believe it's changing. So, Pavla, if we could start with you. I know you have some really deep personal experiences in this area, working in specifically a story about the Slovak government's ties to the Italian mafia. If you could speak a little bit more to that. I know it was really a groundbreaking corruption case and really led to, the implicating judges and police figures and really the whole government. So maybe we could start with you and give us a little insight into that experience or any other experiences that are helpful.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a case that actually started as a murder investigation and ended up with a charge of 21 judges, whole top police management, prosecutors, and some of the politicians. But it really, when my colleague and friend Jano Kuciak was murdered, we just thought that, that most probably there won't be any independent investigation. But people went to the streets and they demanded the resignation of then police president, what was a really important step. Because after the resignation of then police president, the investigation of the murder really developed really quickly. And at some point, we got access to some 70 terabytes of data that we used as a group of journalists who were working on the stories Jano Kuciak started but was never able to finish because he was murdered. And then we started to see the blueprint of corruption. So actually what really started only by the question how Jano was murdered ended up with understanding how capture of the state and actually how corruption works. In kind of a mafia state, and we got to the point when we believe Slovakia, or at least I believe Slovakia is not a state anymore, it's a case study. Because, we inform people took down the government, there was a new government and it just turned up. It's not a good choice that the new government is very chaotic, and now we are at the stage when actually the old system is regaining the power. I just checked the numbers today, and the old system, those two parties that created the old system that enabled murder of a journalist, they are over, in exit polls, they are over 40%. So if there will be early elections or the normal time elections next year, they are back at the power.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Carlos. Let's. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot, but I didn't forget totally. Today at 8 p.m., if you want to know more about the case and how we exposed the blueprint of corruption, there's a film, The Killing of a Journalist, and I really believe it's worth it. It's very gripping.
Where is the?
In Palladium, just next room.
Carlos, Eduardo, over to you. As an investigative journalist, can you give us a little bit insight into some of the challenges or cases that you're dealing with in Latin America, where I think some of the dangerous areas for investigative journalists to work? What my colleague and I were talking about the protection mechanisms for journalists. So maybe you could also tell us about how they've worked, how is that adapted? Just really give us a little bit of insights from your perspective.
Of course. Thanks for the invitation. The first thing that needs to be said is that the guarantees to practice the journalism in Latin America have gone from critical to catastrophic. I'm going to share 5 points to illustrate this statement. First, in 2022, has been the deadliest year for journalism in Mexico. At least 19 journalists has been murdered, and in at least half of the cases, it was proven that their deaths were connected to their profession. And this cifra does not include the number of journalists that have been disappeared. This is the first one. The second one is this year is the year with the highest amount of exiled journalists. The most dramatic situation takes place in Nicaragua, where over 120 journalists have had to flee the country out of fear for being incarcerated. At least 60 of them were unjustifiably linked to alleged case of money laundering. Some of them had their passport withheld, and they were forced to live undocumented and illegally to find shelter in neighboring countries. Similar situations of risk of imprisonment have driven more and more journalists from El Salvador and Guatemala to this forced diaspora. Third point is journalists has been spied on like never before. The case of the Faro, here is Jose Luis, is one of the leaders of the Faro. The Faro and Gato Encerrado in El Salvador impinges the cell phones for more than 30 journalists were intercepted using the Pegasus software. This enabled the content of their equipment to be monitored, and their devices, cameras, and microphones were even activated remotely. Number 4, 20 Cuban journalists from the digital outlet El Toque were forced to resign and threatened to become regulated. That is the word that the regime used by the government to prevent a person from leaving the country. And number 5, laws have started being passed with the aim to regulate the profession. For instance, receiving funds, and which could imply criminal sanctions for bad journalism. And what does it mean, bad journalism? It's not clear, stipulated, and it is open to the interpretation of discretion of the official on duty. And these examples exclude governmental persecution to journalists in Venezuela, deriving from well-known cases that involve the government, or controversial judicial sentences in countries such as Paraguay. Well, the common factor is that there are more and more governments determined to attack instead of to protect, according to your question. Of course, this is a generalization, but the situation is so dramatic, and that is necessary to emphasize and stress it's not to leave no doubt to the fact that the perpetrators are the power structure associated with governments, at least in the case of the exile and judicial persecution. In this scenario, where can protection mechanisms be found? At least 7 countries have announced or implemented some type of protection system: Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and Paraguay. In all fairness, it has to be said that these systems have saved lives. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that when they fail, mistakes are fatal, and Mexico has the terrible badge of honor. Perhaps the oldest of this system is Colombia, a country that has had its ups and downs. At its best, there is a good relation between the authorities and the organizations that defend journalists. And when it's down or down, or it depends on the official leaders who are professional or autonomous. But common factors as to why systems have proven inefficient included low technical capacity for risk studies and for the implementation of protection schemes. Second, lack of resources. This is a common factor too. Third, there are programs more reactive thinking instead to preventing thinking. And fourth, the connection to temporary policies of the government and not to the state. Finally, to finish this really outlook of journalists, the impunity index in the case of assaults against journalists is almost total. Probably Judy from CPJ can talk more about that. This means that the attacking a journalist in Latin America does not entail a real threat of being prosecuted by the law. The questions are, who can protect the journalists? And how can journalists be practiced in the region? The mysticism and the value of the journalists to carry on with good journalists, to keep them excited about training and to denounce the abuse of power are the pillars of an activity that can literally equate civil resistance. In fact, in some countries, it is considered borderline illegal as per new laws. Their solidarity mechanism has been activated through journalistic collaboration, and the consolidation of structures and alliances in the region is enabling support to refuge through difficult situations experienced by many colleagues.
Great, thank you. We started off with a gloomy picture there, but then you took us a little bit on a journey of what types of responses could be effective, but really continuing to think about ways that we need to improve even the useful tools that we have. Okay, B, let's turn over to you in your role at leading the Global Internet Freedom Program. Obviously, you work in a lot of different contexts, and we're talking about an already, targeted group of people. But even within that group of people, there are individuals that have particular vulnerabilities. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the vulnerabilities you see, what is the difference for female identifying journalists or LGBTQI journalists or other vulnerable communities. How do your interventions provide a differentiated approach for these vulnerable communities?
Awesome. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to be here today. I tend to speak really fast, so for anyone who likes to listen to podcasts at like 2 times speed, this is for you right here. So as Ro mentioned, I lead a program called the Greater Internet Freedom Project, or GIF, as we lovingly call it, which works with over 70 organizations in 39 countries across 8 different regions in the world. I won't mention all of them, but it's basically functionally everywhere. And it's the work of these groups in particular and that of my colleagues that really inform my comments today. I myself am not a journalist. I haven't experienced these things personally, but I have deep respect for your work. Generally to cover the kind of digital security threats, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today, that journalists are facing overall. I'll start off by kind of increasingly sophisticated attacks and surveillance by government that the other panelists have mentioned, at least in passing. And that includes some of the scariest, which are phishing attacks that can bypass multi-factor authentication or spyware. And we just heard a lot about the impacts of things like Pegasus and what that looks like for journalists. There are things like spear phishing that I think we're all aware of, but that is kind of social engineered attacks that are meant to have the recipient believe that they're legitimate in order to have them click on malicious links or open malicious documents. DDoS attacks, which basically take your websites offline. At this point in time, most media outlets use tools like Cloudflare or Project Shield to protect themselves against this type of thing, but some don't. At this point overall, it's probably more of an annoyance than a threat, but it's definitely worth considering for more lower capacity organizations or journalists. There are data breaches. Internet shutdowns are a big threat in many areas of the world. And 2 threats that I'll mention now that I'll come back to a little bit later that particularly impact women journalists and vulnerable journalists are doxing and social media harassment. So to frame this conversation, I think it's important to consider that you have journalists, some freelancers, independent journalists, small media outlets that have very low capacity, may not have really any IT staff or digital security capacity in-house, and the threats that they're facing are that of nation states or organized crime that they need to go up against. And so what are the particular vulnerabilities of these journalists as they kind of confront these types of threats? I'm going to bucket those into kind of 2 main areas to look at when considering the specific threats of journalists. And the first one is that many journalists, and I work in the global majority mostly, aren't very well versed in understanding their threat models. And that means understanding what the actual threats that they specifically are facing are and the specific capabilities of their adversaries. It's not every threat out there in the world that every single journalist is facing, but having the ability to understand the specific ones that they are going to be targeted with is crucial. And that helps journalists understand how to be prepared and how to address those things as opposed to being paranoid. And when you can't do that, what we end up seeing is journalists who sort of see risks as inevitable. And so they would rather take their time doing the actual work of journalism and not putting in place the kind of digital security mechanisms that they need to defend themselves. Another kind of important, I would say, vulnerability is that journalists don't easily fit into kind of generally accepted digital security practices or guidance. I'm seeing some nods in the room, so I'm glad that I'm reflecting the things that I've been hearing. So for example, if you tell a journalist to avoid, and this is like digital security 101, if you tell a journalist to avoid clicking on a link or opening an attachment in an email from someone they don't know, that doesn't work, right? That's your bread and butter. It's how you get information. It's how your sources reach out to you. It also, in many countries in which we work, doesn't work to tell journalists to use kind of secure or encrypted tools, which, again, digital security 101, use Signal, use Proton Mail. If that isn't where your sources are, if it's not what your communities use, you're less likely to use it as well. So if that's the guidance you're getting, what do you do as an alternative to keep yourself safe? And so this leads to a lot of frustrations in the communities that we work with. And I'll come back to solutions. I have them, don't worry. And what I will say is that broadly looking at communities of journalists, there is reasonably very little threat sharing that happens amongst journalists or amongst newsrooms, which means that it's even harder to understand what threats are out there and how people are mitigating them. And further, there's often very little local capacity in many countries around the world to provide support to journalists to understand their threats, to mitigate them, and to address specific attacks. Moving from those kind of broad attacks that most journalists face, I did want to take a second to reflect back some of the things that Ro was saying at the outset about specific vulnerable communities. So female journalists, LGBTQ communities, and other vulnerable groups. And this is something that all journalists face, but I think is used specifically to target them, and that is social media. So journalists, unlike a lot of these civil society groups that I also work with, often don't benefit from the kind of cover of working under the cover of their organization or working in coalition with other organizations. Because most journalists use their actual names on their byline. It's how you build trust with your sources. So you are a public face. And what that means is that it's very easy to target journalists, specifically women journalists, online through social media. So they're often the subject of harassment on Twitter, Facebook, other platforms that you know. And there's been a massive rise in these kind of direct attacks and online abuse, which, as Ro mentioned as well, can lead to offline physical violence in many cases. And I'm going to walk you through what these threats look like, but you probably already know them for many of you, but that's harassment, threats, intimidation, bullying, hate speech, texting, trolling, online impersonation, calls for offline violence, disinformation campaigns to discredit the journalist. And then you often see kind of a blurring of lines between a journalist's professional life and their professional phase and their personal life, which leads to kind of doxing attacks where the journalist's personal information is made public, but also where their friends and their family's information is made public as well, including their children, which is rightfully traumatizing, and we'll talk about, I think, the psychosocial support needed there. But in these specific cases of targeted attacks on social media against female journalists, I think it's important to note the perpetrators of this, because this can be done by the general public, but in a report that was recently put out by UNESCO and ICJ, 37% of the female journalists who were surveyed identified political actors as the main perpetrators of online violence. And I think that that's really crucial when we consider the digital safety of journalists, because that type of attack is different than phishing or DDoS attacks, because the goal of that type of attack is not to find out a source, it's not to stop a story from being published. It's really to silence that journalist and get them to step away from the profession entirely. And so these online attacks really, I think, are not just attacks against journalists, but as a colleague in an organization called Misa Zimbabwe said, an attack against journalism itself because it stops this important gendered journalism from happening. And I'll stop there for the moment, but I will come back to solutions.
Thank you, B. I was just looking at some of the stats too, and how the online harassment leads to actual physical harm. One of the stats that I thought was shocking was that 20% of women respondents said they had been attacked or abused offline in connection with an online violence that they had experienced. So it's really a staggering number. Okay, so we've kind of touched on some of the physical threats, the digital threats, heard a little bit about the challenges in Latin America and Eastern Europe. Let's shift gears a little bit to some of the legal challenges. So Alex, I'm going to look to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the growing incidence of these slaps targeted against journalists, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the project with OCCRP and Reporters Shield. Just how and why are these manifesting, and what is the current system to deal with these lawsuits?
Sure. Thank you so much, Ro, and hello, panelists. And hello, everybody. It's great to see you. Alex Papachristou from the Van Center. The Van Center provides pro bono, that means free, legal advice to human rights organizations, environmental organizations, and journalism organizations around the world. We're fortunate to have some clients here from El Faro, from CRIC, from Investigative, and of course, OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. If not our favorite, then certainly our most active client. But favorite, really, come on. The head of it's here, so I have to say it. First, I want to thank OCCRP for a few things. First of all, for having a name as bad as my last name. So, and second of all, for giving the Van Center and me a real-world education in defamation law around the world. Without OCCRP, we wouldn't know about the defamation laws of Cyprus or Switzerland or United Kingdom or the United States, all places where we've helped OCCRP defend itself successfully from litigation. A lot of these cases are funny. The bad people who sue, the oligarchs and kleptocrats and so forth, one of the things they always say is, our name was in a publication called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. That's defamation. Putting our name in a publication with that name is defamatory. Now, of course, that's not true. But what is interesting also about that is that OCCRP is an unusual organization in that it has a specific focus in these areas, and it says so in its own name. And that is a feature of this problem of SLAP suits, strategic litigation against public participation, a terrible name. What it means is people or companies suing without any good reason because they want to punish the journalists. They want to claim to their friends that they sued those guys. Lawsuits that have no basis in the law. And there's something ironic about it, isn't it? These are people who have broken the law. That's what they do. They steal through corruption. They organize themselves as criminal groups. They use their influence as politicians to take bribes. And then, when they're unhappy, they go to the legal system for redress. There's something ironic and wrong about that. And there's also a feature of it which is interesting, and that is that journalists are rather random actors in the world. OCCRP is unusual because it says that it's going to investigate crime and corruption. Most journalists don't define themselves that way. They'll go after a story that, for whatever reason, catches their interest. Either they meet somebody or they get some information and they follow it up and they track it down. And so their actions as far as combating corruption, let's say, are rather random. They don't always focus on that one thing. They focus on what happens to come to them or interest them. So you have random journalism, and then you have this concentrated use or abuse of the legal system by the subjects of the journalism. And that creates a very difficult environment, an environment where lawyers who are paid a lot of money by the corrupt folks come after journalists who are not prepared for this and don't have the money to hire lawyers. Our organization steps in when we can. But we have seen over the years, even just 2 or 3 years, a significant increase in these slap suits, these vexatious, that's a better word, lawsuits. And I think it's for a few reasons. First of all, the journalism is working, right? And so Investigative in the Czech Republic, through, was it the Pandora Papers, actually led to the defeat for re-election of the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. The Panama Papers caused the President of Chile to resign, if I recall. There have been real results from this journalism. Also, of course, the world has gotten worse. There's more authoritarianism and more concentration of power and wealth. And let's face it, there are political figures who are attacking journalists as the enemy of the people. And so we have an environment where there is a greater legal threat to journalism than before. And OCCRP, for example, has seen that in the skyrocketing incidence of these slap suits. And it wins these lawsuits, but it takes a lot of time and it takes money. So Drew Sullivan, the co-founder of OCCRP, and I, for some years now, 6 or so or more, have been working on the idea that now USAID has made possible, and that's Reporters Shield. That's a program that will start next year for pretty much all reporting organizations in the world. Not just journalism organizations, human rights organizations, environmental organizations, any organization that is publishing information in the public interest can participate in this program. Think of it as insurance, because that makes it simpler. And in some aspects it is insurance, but it's more than that. An organization that wants legal protection from these slap lawsuits joins this organization, Reporters Shield. It pays. Think of that as a premium. Now we're going to make it as affordable as possible and look for philanthropy to subsidize organizations that can't afford it. But of course you understand it has to charge something, first of all to survive, and also to convince people that it's worthwhile. You give something free and people don't appreciate it. I know, I give free legal services. Nobody appreciates it. Anyway, this is meant to be a sustainable, forever program. Do you need me to stop? One more minute. So a journalism organization will pay into this program, and it will get training in how to avoid being sued. In some cases, it will have lawyers who will read articles before they're published and advise how they should be changed to limit the risk of being sued. Then, if there is a suit, or even a threat of a suit, if a law firm in London, those are scary people, they send long, threatening letters. Some of you have seen them. We collect them. Jody's had one. You will call Reporters Shield, and we will find a lawyer for you, and we will pay the lawyer. That's why you're paying into this program, so that when you have trouble, you get a lawyer. Sounds like insurance, right? But it has more, because it will work with you, publishers, reporters, to turn these lawsuits into successes. That's what OCCRP did in a case a few years ago in London, where when an Azerbaijani parliamentarian, completely complicit in the Azerbaijani laundromat through a company he owned, sued the co-founder of OCCRP. Took 2 years. But after those 2 years, not only did he drop the lawsuit and pay OCCRP's costs, but the authorities in the United Kingdom went after him with an undisclosed wealth order and stripped him of millions of dollars of property. That's what we want to do. We want to turn slap suits into slap you back suits. And Reporters Shield, we expect, will organize investigative journalists and other journalists together in that effort to turn the tables on these vexatious lawsuits.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. So slaps is a good name because it gives you that little line, that slap you back line. Okay, Jody, we're going to go to even just 1 second. I know you've been waiting so patiently, but I just wanted to see if, Pavla, you had a response just because Alex implicated OCCRP so immensely. Is there anything you wanted to add to some of his comments? And then I promise, Jody, we'll come right back to you.
Yeah, just, actually reaction to what was said here, not only regarding the lawsuits and the threats. I've been through something like probably 8 or 9 lawsuits. At the end, we won them. But at the same time, I'm receiving those kinds of threats, online threats, like in average 2, 3 per week. There's nothing much I can do it, and that's the problem because, it's we are being attacked and we are being made into targets by politicians, and it's a new normal. And it's not only that, the society accepted that politicians are attacking journalists, but we as a journalist, we are just so tired of being threatened that we don't care anymore. If there's one more lawsuit or one less, we don't care. If there's another threat that, someone will harm us, we just don't care because, it's just way over some kind of a baseline. And I think this is really dangerous.
Well, in some ways, that kind of leads, Jody, actually to what I think you'll talk a little bit more about is the impact of this stress, this constantly being targeted, surveilled, harassed, but in addition, the content that you're working with, as well as the burnout. I mean, this broader constellation of impact on the well-being and the psychological state of journalists. And it feels like that's a little bit of a newer area than some of the other areas, digital, that we've been hearing about for the past decade. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what are some of the challenges and touch lightly on the responses, but we'll have more time for that as well.
Yeah, sure, and I will keep it brief because I know that I can see a number of people here who have first-hand experience of some of these things that we're talking about, and it would be great to hear from you. Listen, I've been a journalist for 25 years. When I started as a journalist, I was lucky to have journalism training, and that involved, for those of you who are journalists, being taught the inverted pyramid of news, the 4 Ws, all the good skills of journalism and freedom from bias and ethics training. If you happened to be sent to a war zone, you would get security training for a war zone, and that was it. There was no training for journalists, and I work for an organization that gave extremely good training. We were considered at the top of our game in terms of training for journalists, but there was no training available then for journalists to understand how to interview subjects of trauma effectively and sensitively, and there was certainly very little understanding of the trauma that was involved in reporting on issues beyond war zones, even in war zones, and the trauma that came from reporting on riots, protests, discrimination, abuse, and the effects that has on you as an individual, as you as a reporter, seeing and experiencing those traumatic situations, your communities being essentially eviscerated in some places, seeing your community mistreated and maltreated, and the effect, the percussive effect that that has on you as an individual. And that's before journalists became targets, right? So that's before. So it is traumatic. Much of the work that journalists are involved in is traumatic because of the nature of the subject. And then we became targets. We became targets. And that is new. In some countries, particularly authoritarian regimes, that's always been the case. But it is certainly new, in my experience, that journalists sitting here in Washington or in Westminster or elsewhere, political reporters, local reporters reporting on their local school boards or their local courthouses, themselves would become subjects of harassment. And we see it every single day. And the experiences we've heard here are absolutely normal. It is totally normal now for a journalist reporting on politics, even in a local community. I'm not talking about national politics, local politics, to be on the receiving end of abusive material, highly explicit material online. And as we heard, often, very often, that online violence and harassment translates directly into offline harassment. If you think about it, if you are a reasonably well-known reporter in your local community, people know where you live. You're highly visible at the local parade. You're highly visible at the political rally. And God forbid that you should be in a country where carrying guns is the norm. You are highly, highly at risk. And that is huge. That impact that has on journalists is huge. And I think you're right in that we've only just really become aware of that impact and how damaging that is, because the net result is, at a certain point you say, this is enough. This is enough. You know, the worst is that you're actually targeted and physically assaulted or worse, killed. But you know, if you don't get to that point, many people just say, this isn't worth it. I didn't come into this. I want to change the world. I don't necessarily want to feel every day like I am the enemy and that I'm at risk and that my family's at risk, so I stop. So that's, this abuse and trauma that journalists are experiencing directly impacts our ability to receive information, because journalists are simply stopping and pulling away, self-censoring, not covering certain topics, or coming out of the industry altogether. And I think we are starting to see newsrooms become alive to that and offer support. We are starting to see networks of organizations like Committee to Protect Journalists, but there's many others starting to come together to provide support for journalists. But I think it's really important, as we've been doing here, to understand all of the factors that create that situation, because ultimately we can continue to up the support that we provide to journalists in terms of trauma support, but we can't do that endlessly. And so we need to match the investment that we make and the support that we give to journalists to deal with trauma with continued efforts to prevent the trauma being enacted in the first place. Otherwise, we're only ever continuing to put sticking plasters on the problem.
Okay, that's actually a good segue into our next round of comments, and we'll just take a few minutes because we do want to move over to Q&A, and we've touched upon a few of the responses, but maybe each of you could take another minute or two to talk a little bit more about what are the gaps in resources. I mean, you are here in Washington with policymakers and donors who are trying to fill these gaps. We're trying to get ahead of or trying to respond, trying to get ahead of the responses, because I think, Jody, you're absolutely right. If we're just, in the case of psychological support, if we're constantly providing the support but not preventing it, it'll feel endless. So let's just take a minute to go into what are those gaps in resources, and what would you ask from our audience and others how to respond to that. Pavla, can we first start with you? Is that okay? I'm sure you have a long list, right?
No, actually, I'm going to talk about something else, because I'm a journalist, so I care about the stories. And there's a recent trend in financing investigative centers, and that's, we will give you training, and after our training, we might give you money to work on the stories. And actually what's happening right now is like we have trainings on digital security every 2 months, and it's actually pretty much the same, and we just need to spend this time on those trainings. Otherwise, we would not be able to apply for the grant. Or there is much more money spent on research, if investigative journalism matters, than actually on investigative journalism. And, you know, I am so tired of it, you know? Like, I am working on some research, I am replying to some research if investigative journalism matters, couple of times per month. And, you know, I do understand that, you know, it's a cool study to research, but at the same time, could we just go back to what journalism is about, and those are the stories?
No, I mean, I think in many ways you answered the question exactly, you know, as we hope. You know, what needs to change? How does the system need to, you know, accommodate your needs so that you can do your job? So, in fact, it was straightforward and direct, so thank you. Carlos, over to you. What in your opinion, where are the gaps, where could we do better?
Yes, I agree with Paula, and it's a huge paradox, no? The quality of journalism has increased in recent years in Latin America, as have the impact reach of the stories. Yet more extreme sectors have become radical and stand that emphasizes the need to continue contributing. Changes in the industry show that the vulnerability is present not only in independent or freelance outlets. No? Overall, all of them are facing challenges and sustainability and continuity. Connectus was founded 10 years ago, and from early on, we had the opportunity to join forces with ICFJ to foster the Investigative Reporter Initiative in the Americas. It has been a significant alliance that has largely helped us to build our capacity and to build us as a key organization that work as an essential gears to practice journalism in the aforementioned context that I mentioned before. Some years ago, talking about a journalism platform for transnational collaboration seemed exotic. It was also so exotic to produce high-quality journalism simultaneously with a training process. But today, it is a reality in progress. We have consolidated a model that has changed and created a safe space for journalistic production, following proven methodologies and with robust editorial alliance. All of these factors provide a safe environmental and sustained output of content that is influential, impactful, with reach and visibility. With active members in 19 countries throughout the region, the expectation is to sustain these efforts in the long run. What is next? The connection between journalists has to endure, and it is connected with our existing value-generating relationships. The challenge now is the positive emergence of entrepreneurial endeavors. Collaborative work among journalists is already showing a key to avoid censorship and control and increase the impact and relevance of the issues, but it should not be only among journalists, but also with other sectors, which are also being key even to practice journalism. An example that our colleague in the panel showed is the recent legal process that a group of journalists from El Faro decided to open here in the United States against the company in charge of the Pegasus software. What's happened there can clearly show how the balance tilts it's the tension that is like the fight of David against Goliath, no? It's similar like that. We don't want to go from the era of the lone wolf to the era of the lonely ants. No? And we need to attain more articulation and coordination with the new endeavors and the new in the new environmental system. As yesterday, Samantha Powers mentioned, the hundreds of pieces of deep and investigative reports has been helped to expose the mismanagement of billions of dollars in the case of Latin America. The perspective of corruption in the region also poses interesting challenges as it has been exposed in this conference. Aside from the missing funds, there are multiple manifestations of corruption with need for their capacity. For instance, corruption in justice. We published a feature today about what's happening in Guatemala. I invite to go to connectus.org and to read the stories in English too. And additionally, we have to raise our voices in case of lack of transparency, which open the door to abuse of power. We need to point out wrongful benefits and cases of public administration, mishandling scenarios that seems to be very convenient for a select few. The impact of the war undertaken in our society lies in straining democracy and the rule of law. Democracy, that at times seems to be dissolving, is not just having impact or recovery of report funds. The possibility to continue practicing journalism is critical for these changes that our society so desperately needs. It is the best investment. It has proven to have low costs and large returns in the consolidation of democracy in our countries and empowering our societies.
Great, thank you. Just because you mentioned, Alex, in the work, maybe we could just go over to you quickly. Is there any, you gave us a great description of some of the innovative work already done to respond to these legal challenges. Are there other responses or resources that would help in this space, or did we
Yes.
take all the good ideas and execute them already?
Not yet, no. So even more precious than money would be fresh perspective and stronger political will. So this administration in Washington has broached the idea that one of this country's strongest exports is independent journalism. That's starting to be something that we're appreciating, happens very well here. Problems, yes, absolutely, but and it's something that we export around the world. But we need to turn that inchoate vision into action. So we need to insist that England and Wales pass anti-SLAPP legislation, that the European Union passes an anti-SLAPP directive. We need to insist that ultimate beneficial ownership be subject to public access for journalists and anyone else. We have to start here in our own country with that one, but we also have to insist that it happen, that the EU overturn a recent decision saying that whether you really are the beneficial owner of a company is a matter of privacy under the European Charter of Human Rights. That's ridiculous. So we need to be much more aggressive to implement reforms that are underway, and we need to use tools. So the United States is going to negotiate a new trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Make part of that a requirement that the United Kingdom have protection for journalism. So that's my sense of how we could really push what's starting to happen much further and make a real difference.
Great, thank you. I'm sure there were a lot of conversations about beneficial ownership the last 2 days and how to crack that nut, so hopefully we'll get there. B, let me go back to you. If you could, not necessarily redesign GIF, but what components would you add to it, at this moment in time, knowing what the needs are and how we could maybe improve upon our work?
I mean, if I could redesign a giant USAID project, there would probably be less paperwork, if we're honest about it. So I think in looking at what maybe in thinking about this specific project, I think the things that we would kind of double down on in terms of our work and what we do right now. I'm going to try and make this fast because I think there's a lot of really good other opinions on this panel, and I do want to be conscious of what Pavla just said. We work in a lot of communities where there aren't digital security trainings that are available. But I would say making a digital security training a requirement for your grantee or forcing them to take one when they've already had it is probably the worst approach as a funder you could possibly take, so I wouldn't do that. But I would say in the communities in which we work where that doesn't happen, having kind of locally relevant trainings that are given by trainers from that community who speak the language, who can use examples and case studies that are specific to that community. That is really crucial, and also that understand how that community uses IT tools and their specific fluency with that is all crucial. So really kind of tailored tools to communities. We also are focusing a lot on building kind of the broader ecosystem of support for journalists. Journalists don't exist in a vacuum. They need to rely on others for certain skills, and we focus on digital security. So we try, when we go into communities where there's very low digital security capacity, to identify individuals or possibly organizations that can become those focal points, and then provide them with the skills over time, starting from scratch and building from there, so that they can be resources for local journalists. And increasingly in the last few years, given the kind of rapidly increasing level of sophistication of the attacks on journalists, we've also been focusing a lot more on developing the capacity at the local level to address advanced threats. Currently, only a few organizations in the world address advanced threats. Most of them are in Canada, the US, and Europe. And so the kind of services they can provide to local journalists and local media outlets is limited because they don't have the required local knowledge. To give you an example of what that looks like, because when I started working on in this project and advanced threats were mentioned, I didn't really know what that meant. It's something like, we noticed that our partners don't have knowledge of mobile forensics, even if they're people who understand digital security. So what that means in practice is that you might see something on a cell phone that is actually, if you had a basic knowledge of mobile forensics, something that you would understand is not actually a threat that you could pass over. But what was actually happening is that these issues were being brought up to organizations like Amnesty, Citizen Lab, which are fantastic, but it meant that their time and energy was then focused on these non-issues. So what we did was we created locally relevant trainings that taught our partners how to do basic analysis on these things and kind of be a front line of defense at the local level so that they could triage issues and only send the actual important threats to the international organizations. And I think that that's the type of thing that is going to become increasingly important in the digital security community as we support journalists. I think we've talked a lot about online threats and online harassment. And I think within the digital security community, we've not done a great job at considering that's part of digital security itself. And so we, as this community, need to be doing a better job of broadening our scope to include that as a fundamental part of digital security trainings. And also to consider the impacts of that, I think, in our work as well. And then if we take a step away from the specific tech and kind of training responses, there's a lot of policy approaches that we can be working on as a broader community in terms of pushing tech companies to have better reporting mechanisms, having their policies in local languages, because they rarely do, ensuring that there's an easy way to raise up your issue quickly. Because if you're facing death threats, if you're facing rape threats, you can't be waiting 48 hours for someone to get back to you on your issue, and you need someone who speaks your language. So these are all things that we can be pushing tech companies to do. And then we can also be working with civil society, legislators, to ensure that online gender-based violence is a crime if it isn't currently in your local context, and also that when you bring these issues to your local police, that they understand it as a crime, even if it happened online and not offline. There's a ton of different ways, and I'll stop there, but those are kind of some of the things that we work on and would love to see others take on as well.
Thank you. Josh, I'm looking at you because I know there has to be better ways of lifting up some of the challenges and issues, as you highlighted, when you're seeing these attacks happen. I think via email and is not the most effective way, so a system or a policy would be helpful. Okay, Jody, let's hand it over to you. Before we go, we're going to go to Q&A in just a minute, so hopefully you have your questions ready. But before we do that, I know you began to unpack a lot of the layers of the stress and trauma and started to give us a little bit of insight of the support that can be provided, and it sounds like we've got a long way to go. But is there you want to leave us with any policy recommendations or additional gaps in resources that we should be looking at?
I think what I want to do most of all is have a bit of a reality check, right? I think when we get into spaces like this, we tend to suddenly see journalism or human rights defense as this big, homogenous blob that if we could come up with a magic policy, we would suddenly fix everything. And I was struck by something I think that Alex said, that he talked about journalists, and I totally agree, as random actors. And we are, right? We're individuals. If there's some hallmarks of being a journalist, I think it's that we don't really like being organized, we don't really like being told what to do, and we really, really don't like asking for help. And I think all of those things are really important when we come to thinking about designing policies, about designing trainings, because whatever you do, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to fix this problem. And so unless we have flexible funding, locally driven support, we are never going to address this issue. So that would be my one takeaway. I couldn't agree with B more. I think locally led, locally relevant is true of all kinds of training and support, including trauma support. So just to give you one example, CPJ recently just completed a 3-day trauma and resilience training in Thailand for Burmese journalists in exile. And that came about because the local partner that we worked with identified that many of these individuals did not want the kind of one-on-one training that has become sort of quite standard offering when we're thinking about psychosocial support. So this was a community-led, locally driven initiative in which individuals did things like breathing exercises and so on. And two things about that is, I cannot stress, as I said, enough how important it is for that to be locally driven, and that is true of trauma training. It's also true of, frankly, social media companies listening to the needs of journalists and others so we can actually stop the harassment in the first place, and the ways to do that. But the other thing is that really takes an approach that sees news organizations, journalism as being driven by individuals, and that we have to support the individuals. So making sure that whatever aid packages the US comes up with, or whatever support packages funders come up with, they understand that you need to be able to provide targeted, in some cases, highly individualistic support in order to be effective.
Great, thank you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for being candid and frank. I guess you're absolutely right, Jody. It's a unique group that obviously has strong ideas about what changes need to happen to respond to this set of challenges we've discussed. Josh and Shanna, the Q&A, how would we like to do that? Would you raise your hand now and we could go around? That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, right here, and then over there. Mm-hmm. Let's take two, if that's okay, 2 or 3. Let's take the 3. I think we could handle it, right?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for an interesting presentation, and thank you for all of you guys for giving this honest story to us. So my name is Ekagi Gauri. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Georgia. I'm also with the board of TI. And many things that you have mentioned, actually, it's like really happening in Georgia as well. So we see these attacks and physical attacks also on our journalists. During the last several years, we had 90 cases like this. Just 1 year ago, we had the attacks on 53 journalists at the same time from far-right groups. We had the cases when the women journalists were threatened if they don't stop, publishing the critical reports, their personal live videos will be uploaded on the Facebook, and that was also the case. In our situation in Georgia, so many owners of medias, the critical medias, are under the investigation. One is in the prison for no grounds. And what tendency we have now is that the government representatives are targeting particular journalists, individual journalists, even for asking the critical question. I'm not speaking about the investigative report or something, and then they ask our political, the court, which is under the political influence, to freeze the assets of particular journalists, and apparently that's happening nowadays. So what I'm saying is that it is just happening during this, and we are defending now around 200 journalists. TI Georgia is now defending 200 journalists in Georgia. So my question is, what the international community, the professional groups, maybe the NGO community should do in order to avoid such situations before it's too late. Because in Georgia's case, it started 2 years ago, and now it's growing and growing and growing. And apparently many actors on the ground, sorry for this long, but many actors on the ground, especially the international community, also buying this argument that this critical media has problems with the quality of reporting. And this is also a problem that we have. So, and they say, okay, so maybe they have some problems there, and maybe it's not a good idea now to help them, maybe to find a new alternative kind of ways of reporting, supporting the alternative media, and let's forget about them because some of them made some mistakes when reporting about the corruption. Yeah, it's again the quality of reporting. So my question is, what should be done in order to avoid such situation before it's too late? Because at some point it might be so late that all these people just leave the country and you can do anything, but then it does not really make sense because no one will exist on the ground. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's just take one question. This one's good, and then and right behind you.
Chokoma Ifremokenwa is my name, from Nigeria. My question is to Jody and also the panelists by the side. Mine is that of a concern of inclusion. So at the moment, for the Committee on the Protection of Journalists, is the issue of states that are where journalists are most affected, is it really prioritized by the committee, and as well as for the proposed legal aid and assistance to journalists, because I'm concerned where Africa falling in all of this, and of course for Nigeria, where is a recurrent index for journalists to disappear. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can we get one more back there, if that's okay?
Thank you, everybody, for the very good presentation. I got a lot of answers I was looking for. My name is Sean Akinfolari from Civic Media Lab, also from Nigeria. I just want to present a slight variation in the attack vector that we experienced at Civic Media Lab. So what we do is we support grassroots newsrooms to do stories, but then when they do the investigative stories, they came after us. When they did the story, they came after us, and they froze our account. And they kept us in court for 2 years, but we had a network of support of other non-profits that kept us afloat in that period. So we could have died in 2 years, right? So I like what Alex was talking about, the reporter's shield. I just want to find out if there's any other mechanism that can be someone like us could leverage, because I know that we're one story away from being shut down again, right? So I'd just like what your advice would be to protect us.
Great. Who wants to start with comments on some of the scenarios we heard? Yeah, please do.
I have advice for Georgian journalists, in case they are not able to ask questions and do the reporting because it may put them in danger somehow, they should go international and ask their colleagues from the rest of the Europe, let's say, to ask those questions and to work to work on the story as well. So it's a kind of protection. We do it quite often at OCCRP, and it works really well, because then they can report, like, you know, investigative journalists from OCCRP reported that. And it's kind of protection.
Kind of spread the risk a bit. Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So, in addition to that, I think one of the things that we have to do is raise the diplomatic consequences of these things. There's a number of networks now operating ostensibly to support media freedom globally. Sometimes we see them as to be effective, sometimes we don't see them to be effective. But I think one of the things that we've certainly been asking, for example, of the Media Freedom Coalition groups, is that they really engage their diplomatic networks, because often that's a form of pressure that can be exerted on governments when they see governments behaving in a way that does not defend press freedom and enables them to show that they are being watched. And we found that to be effective, and we'd like to see more of that. So I think that's one way, is to try to, that we can put pressure on diplomatic missions in country to try and raise the pressure for the local government. In terms of inclusion, I think your point is extremely well made. Actually, for CPJ, our Africa program is our highest staffed program. I do think that many of these issues in terms of media freedom get lost. In recent years, we have had the crisis in Myanmar, crisis in Afghanistan, and now, of course, the crisis in Ukraine. That has somewhat, I think, taken some of the attention away from ongoing crises elsewhere, and we are absolutely acutely aware. In fact, one of my colleagues just came back from Nigeria, of the continued pressure on journalists on the continent. So we are very keen to make sure that we are keeping that in people's minds, because it's very key. And I think, other people have said this, but we have to keep putting the pressure on international governments to link together the support that they give to governments and the commitment to human rights. And far too often, governments talk a good talk about defending human rights, but actually continue to trade with countries, continue to give them aid, and that means that people can continue to undermine human rights while receiving the money, and that's got to stop. And so I think being much more active in that area will also yield, I hope, some results in coming years.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. So what I was suggesting earlier builds on what Jody just said about respecting human rights. We have to think about journalism not as media freedom only, but as a service or a product that has a value in the market. Now, I don't say this as some sort of capitalistic character. I say it because in political discourse and in international relations and negotiations, framing is important. And on government agendas, human rights may not be at the top, but trade in goods and services should be. So we should, journalists hate to think that they're in business, right? As Jody was saying, journalists are individualistic, stubborn, iconoclastic, all of those wonderful things. But in fact, you don't succeed as a journalist unless somehow there's some transaction of value. And I think we should think in those terms sometimes if we want to advance rights. It's not about human rights only, it's about business rights. And so I want to just build on what Jody said in that regard. With respect to Nigeria today, what we're trying to do with Reporter Shield is take what we've done somewhat occasionally and turn it into a regular program. But today, you can call us at the Van Center and say, we're a journalism organization, we're under threat in Nigeria for this or that, and we will see what we can do to help you, and we will look to lawyers in Nigeria to join us to defend you. So Reporter Shield wants to do that systematically. And as you start to think about it, here in Georgia, how many, just Georgia, wonderful country, but not the biggest in the world, and maybe the best in the world. But anyway, how do you take on Georgia and Nigeria at the same time, plus a few others? So it's going to be a big undertaking, but we're going to try. We're going to do it case by case. And so we can start with those cases even now.
Sorry, I just wanted to, as you were talking, I just suddenly remembered something I wanted to say about Georgia, and I think we're not talking about it enough, but I suspect that next year this is going to become increasingly an issue. Is one of the things we're increasingly seeing is because of the continued uncertainties and complexities of crises around the world, we're seeing more and more journalists go into exile. So we have a number of colleagues, Russian colleagues, who've gone into exile in Georgia, for example. So what we're finding is journalists move out of one environment that feels unsafe for journalists into another environment that is not safe for journalists. We've seen a number of Iranian journalists go to Turkey, for example, which until recently was one of the world's worst jailers of journalists. And so I think we need to be alive in terms of policy making to that new complexity as well, which is that in order to flee one unsafe environment and one environment that's poor for media freedom and safety of journalists, people are putting themselves at risk in countries that are also unsafe for journalists, and trying to be alive to that when funders are looking to support programs, I think is really important.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Alex. That is an interesting framing. We'll have to unpack that a little bit more. Let's do one more round of questions. Raise your hand now. Yeah? Okay, we've got 3 here. So 1 here and then 2 over there. Great. We'll take them all together.
Hi. Hi, Ro.
Jeff?
Hello. Hi, Josh. I'm Tom Bridle. I used to work with Ro in the DRG Center. I'm at Chemonics now. I want to ask a question about a little bit off of the direct threat to journalists, but on the sustainability of the media institutions where those journalists work. Because if journalists don't have some place to journalize, they sort of lose their functionality, right? So you need to have the newspapers, the TV outlets, the radio outlets, the internet outlets, and all those mechanisms for bringing stories to the people. And my sense is that as you bring stories out more, there's, I guess, to some extent, threats increase. To some extent, that has a protective quality as well, as more people are aware of journalism and the benefits of journalism. But when I see a lot of the RFPs that in USAID proposals that include a media component, there's a discussion of sort of sustainability of these institutions and making them sustainable and independent. And it always strikes me as sort of ironic because most media institutions in the US are not really particularly struggling to maintain sustainability, and sustainability in the context of economies that are controlled by autocrats is very problematic, right? So I wonder if you could just have some thoughts about what does it really mean to have a sustainable media institution? How do you do that in environments where the private sector, which would be the natural source of the capital, is very problematic? The state is very problematic. The donors are not ideal. What do you do?
Great, thank you, Tom. Difficult question. 2 more over here.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Baji Koulibaly from Bamako, Mali. So my thanking goes to your brilliant panel about raising this topical issue. So I avail this space to pay tribute to all journalists. So this fight is not a Galapati. Even though the path is thorny, muddy, they should not give up. So coming back to your panel discussion, in the course of your discussion, you've raised something related to violence online and harassment. So as old soldiers, veteran, what would you advise to those journalists victims of harassment online? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And one more right behind you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the panelists. It was quite impressive. My name is Maha. I work for DT Institute. It's a nonprofit based in DC, and I'm originally from Sudan. I have a couple of quick questions. One, how to mitigate or alleviate the risk of the campaigns when we are campaigning for journalists, incarcerated journalists, or journalists who are being exposed to human rights violations in their countries, meaning that in context of repressive and authoritarian regimes, sometimes campaigning for those victims can lead to reverse results. So how can we mitigate that risk? My other question is, I was thinking about the popular correspondence and investigative journalists in very local level, like in the IDPs camps in Darfur in Sudan. It's a location where there is no internet, there is no electricity, no even telephone signals. So how can we help them to protect the data that they have, and even to ensure their safety, and to mediate opportunities for them to deliver the data that they have? Thank you.
Great. All right. Yeah, okay. Alex, why don't you take one of them, and then B, I'm sure you've got some responses. The media sustainability question, and that's up for grabs for any of our experts here.
I have it somewhere here in my pocket. Maybe it's in the other jacket. So what is journalism doing, right? It's educating people, right? And if we think about it, it's education. It's a public good, so there should be public resources for it. So, like USAID putting money into Reporters' Shield. It's also uncovering corruption and crime, and then law enforcement is seizing assets and weighing fines and penalties on perpetrators. And so there is actually a benefit, a cash benefit that comes from it. This is another one of Drew's Don Quixote issues. You know, there should be a percentage of recovered assets that you can trace specifically to journalistic investigations that goes back to the journalists, right? Mm-hmm. So if you just connect a few dots, what is journalism doing, and you come up with some ideas, and what we've done so far is not connect those dots, but throw ourselves at the beneficence of billionaires and say, please fund us for another 2 years, and you know, then we'll find another billionaire who will keep us going, and that doesn't seem terribly sustainable or even sensible. So I think we have to have different thinking about it, and so say I'll get that out of my pocket one of these days.
I mean, Josh, it speaks to something we were talking about this morning, this business mindset. I mean, it is a shift, right? It's not how I think we're used to, at least in the government, how we're used to thinking about it, but we might need to wrap our minds. That's why I said, Alex, that framing that you gave, it's a different approach, but maybe we have to move a little bit more in that direction. And, you know, the Media Viability Accelerator, we are, I think, thinking, you know, in those directions, but a lot more to do there. B, shall I hand it over to you on some of the responses? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I saw you writing ferociously.
I was making notes. I wouldn't forget anything.
Or if others want to jump in before you're done? No? Okay, go for it.
I can go for it. All right. Donc, le Monsieur du Mali, bonjour. So I think your question for everyone else was what your advice would be to journalists that are harassed online. I don't have any context for exactly what's happening there, but my high-level notes for this person would be, one, ensure that their accounts are secure. So things like multi-factor authentication should be set up, the basic digital security practices there, and have a backup account, I think, if you're a journalist. Report to the tech company that this is happening on, and if it's relevant, I don't know what's happening, report to the police if you can, take screenshots, take links to where this is happening, document. And then also ensure that you're providing support to the victim. I'm sure others can speak to this a little bit more, but things like if they don't want to be in charge of their account for a while and they want someone to step in for them to deal with it, that might be a good approach. Just figure out what they need and provide that support. It would be like not knowing any context of what's happening. My top 3 thoughts for you on what to do there, assuming that there's not like a newsroom that has a policy that can support them. For the woman from Sudan, I feel like my response is going to be a lot less detailed on this one, but I think your question was, how do you protect data in offline environments until you get to an online environment? I hate myself for saying this, but I think it depends what exactly you're trying to protect against in this context. Like, I'm not clear what the specific concern is, but if you come see me right after the panel, I can talk you through it and put you in touch with colleagues who work in those environments. That'll help you a lot more. Sorry.
Yep, we can meet after. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up there because it's late in the day. But actually, let me just see if anyone has any final comments you want to make before we wrap it up. Any parting messages you want to leave this group with, or we feel like we got it all in? Okay, great. I know it's been a long day. These are heavy topics, a lot of information to absorb, but I really just want to thank our panelists. As I said, we covered a lot of ground. We laid out the challenges, but also tried to come with some of the solutions and responses. As I said, you were candid, which is what we expect and what we hope, because that's the only way we're really going to improve and be able to be more responsive. Jody, I take to heart the flexible funding and the locally driven support. The word I often use is authentic localization. I think, as many of you know, that shift for the U.S. government to hand over ownership, decision-making, that's a big shift, a culture shift. So I think we're moving in that direction, but these kinds of conversations continue to reinforce the types of changes that we're making. So continue to keep the pressure on us. And continue to work collaboratively on these really thorny and really difficult challenges that you all are facing. But please see us as partners in this endeavor. So thank you again, and thank you to our participants for joining us in this conversation. Thank you, team.
Nice to meet you, V. It's